Mūsų karta pirmoji, supratusi, kaip iš lėto kenkiame gamtai. Ir vienintelė, žinanti, kad dar yra laiko ją išsaugoti. Apsaugokime mūsų visų ateitį. Ergo.
The laws of physics, the laws of life. Laws connect everything. We think that to be legal advisors, we must live under the same philosophy, adapting to connect and connecting to adapt.
Nepraleiskite laiko veltui. Nauji kino festivaliuose kritikus ir žiūrovus sužavėję filmai. Elito kinas. Ketvirtadienio vakarais per LRT+.
Kad būtum, reikia kito. Kino Pavasaris. Kovo 24, balandžio 3 dienomis visoje Lietuvoje. Didysis partneris Ergo draudimo grupė. Informaciniai partneriai LRT 15 min žmonės.
Labas vakaras, mėly Kino Pavasario žiūrovai. Šiandien man tenka neįtikėtinai didelis malonumas ir didelė garbė vesti diskusiją su filmo SPARKS broliai režisieriumi Edgar Wright, kurioje labai kviečiu jūs aktyviai dalyvauti, kadangi, kaip ir užsimeniau prieš filmo seansą, turbūt ne kasdien pasitaiko tokia galimybė užduoti klausimus pačiam režisieriui, tad labai kviečiu jūs prisijungti ir būti aktyviems. So without further ado, I'd like to present to you the director of the SPARKS brothers, Edgar Wright.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Mr. Wright, how are you?
I'm good, how are you doing?
We are very excited after the film, that's for sure, and we have quite a few questions to you. So I'm gonna start, I guess, at the very beginning to summarize the film. Even though it's very hard to do that, I'd say that it's a wonderfully rich documentary that gives us insight into lives and work of brilliant musicians, Ron and Russell Mael, known as the SPARKS since 50 years ago up until now. So first things first, I think that we are all very much interested to know how, when, and why, most importantly, did you decide to work on this project?
Well, as I say in the film, I've been a fan for a long time. And in the last, I guess like 7 years, I'd really started to become just more and more impressed with their sort of contemporary output. And I thought it was really surprising because a lot of other bands that have been going that long, you know, they don't necessarily tend to create such great work in their sort of 5th decade or 6th decade in SPARKS' case. So I was sort of kind of just really surprised by that. And as a fan, I always felt like SPARKS deserved, even though they have a big cult following, I always felt like they deserved more because, you know, I'd find myself having to explain to people who SPARKS were quite a lot. And eventually that turned into me saying, somebody should do a documentary about SPARKS. You know, why hasn't somebody done a documentary about SPARKS? They're such an interesting band and they have such a great history. And so I kept saying this. And then eventually one of my friends, the director, Phil Lord, at a SPARKS gig, actually, I said, somebody should make a documentary about SPARKS. And he said, you should make the documentary about SPARKS. And I think as somebody finally pointed it back at me, I said, yeah, okay, I will. And that night I suggested to Ron and Russell Mael that I should do a documentary about them.
And this was how many years ago you mentioned?
That was in 2017. I had first met them in 2015. So yeah.
I was wondering as well, because now and in the film you have mentioned this fascination with the SPARKS or SPARKS. when it comes to their forever evolving and changing nature and their, in a way, maybe unpredictability and freedom within the genre. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, maybe what particularly appeals to you when it comes to their music as a fan and as well as a filmmaker, maybe.
I think probably like first, like when I was very young listening to them, you know, they're incredibly catchy. But I remember when I was very young, like when I was about 5 or 6, my parents used to buy me and my brother these chart compilation albums, and I had 2 Sparks tracks on those, and I would really like them, but I'd be trying to figure out what the lyrics meant. And when you're like that age and you're listening to these witty lyrics about life, you almost like trying to sort of like understand like, you know, grown up things in songs. I almost like equate it to, I used to listen to like Monty Python albums a lot, and I used to find myself trying to learn what it all meant. So there was a sort of big part of it about deciphering Sparks lyrics was like something that was like an ongoing education in a way. And then the fact that they keep changing their style, I always thought was really like brave and interesting, because there was this kind of restless nature to their creativity, is that if they kind of hit on a great sound, they would just kind of keep moving. And I find that inspiring because, you know, hopefully with my films, try and do something different each time, because the idea of doing the same thing every time is not so interesting. And I admire that about Sparks, that they keep sort of pushing forward and just trying new things all the time.
And I think in the film you mentioned that you became particularly interested in the music of Sparks in their period of 1979, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So I was
not born when the first album came out.
So I was wondering, actually, because there is a very funny part within the film. At least I found it extremely funny that there are all of these misconceptions about the band, even of their origins. And since you were a fan since a long time ago, I was just wondering if you ever thought that they were British, because evidently there are a lot of people that did think that they were British.
It's a good question. I mean, I didn't know where they were from at all. And I'm not even sure that I knew that they were brothers. Like, the thing that really struck me as a 5-year-old watching Sparks on TV in 1979 was the fact that they weren't smiling, because every other like band that were on Top of the Pops, like ABBA, would be all smiles, and Sparks were like kind of like completely poker-faced. And the thing is, even as a 5-year-old, you sort of could recognize that. And you felt, I remember watching them on Top of the Pops in 1979 and feeling like, you know, that I was in trouble. Like, they're staring at me. It's like, oh my God, what have I done wrong? So it's like a very like disconcerting feeling about it. I think also in a pre-internet age, your knowledge of a band was directly related to how popular they were. Because if it wasn't a really big band that were all over the newspapers and the TV and the radio, you know, you just have to rely on the band coming back into your airspace again. And with a band like Sparks, it could be years between hearing about them. And in fact, in the UK, they had hits in 1979 and 1980. And then they didn't have another hit in the UK until 1994. So unless you were a fan club member or you were really able to follow the band, again, this is before the internet, where like now everybody's information is everywhere, it was really difficult to track them. So when they did come back in 1994, I was like dumbfounded, because now I'm like 20 and I was like, wait, this is the band that I saw when I was 5 years old. And here they are with a different style of music, and it can't be the same Sparks. It is the same Sparks. So it left me very confused. And it's only really in the last, since the advent of the internet and being able to read up more on bands, that I was able to kind of put together who Sparks were and what their discography was.
The whole notion of forever reinventing yourself, and as we've discussed, as not being stuck in one kind of genre and traveling through the world of music in such vast of ways that it's unimaginable. I was wondering, actually, what you just mentioned right now, the fact that you, as a big fan, as a big fan of the band, that the next song that comes out, that you no longer can recognize them. How do you think that maybe that was the main, in a way, stumbling block for the band and all the setbacks that they had, and how did you perceive their evolution of the music? You already have mentioned a little bit that it was difficult to recognize the band from one song to another. How did you perceive, as a big fan, their evolution of the music, and maybe how do you look at it right now, retrospectively?
I think partly with them, at several points, it's out of necessity. They have to try something different. And, there's a couple of albums in a row, between Indiscreet and Big Beat and Introducing Sparks and Number One in Heaven, they changed their sound 4 times in a row. And I think part of that is because at that time there was maybe a failure to kind of connect with the audience. And then Number One in Heaven did connect, and it was a big hit in the UK and in Europe. So sometimes I think they do it out of necessity. And then I think after a while, it's sort of become their good luck charm. They sort of know that the only way to kind of evolve is to sort of keep switching it up all the time. And I think, there are other bands who kind of hit on a formula and just kind of drive that formula into the ground. And I think in a way, Sparks kind of having had kind of peaks of kind of cult success and some kind of hits, but they've always found that the best way to sort of proceed is to try something different. And I think that probably is because also their first proper hit, This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us, which was a big hit in the UK and in the rest of Europe. And it's a very unconventional song. And so I think that probably has put them in that mindset where that song is a pretty weird song, and for it to be a hit. And so it's not something where it's kind of going back to something formulaic. It's going back to something inventive and out there. And I think so that the fact that that's their big hit song has probably always made them confident in the idea that doing something out of left field is always the best way to go. And
given that their music is so diverse, I was very much wondering as well, once you've decided to work on this project, how did you start? Whether you started with the analysis of their music, if so, what was the process, and or whether you started with the archives, etc.
Well, I think the thing that was part of my pitch to them, which is one of the reasons that they wanted to do it, is because I felt it was important for the documentary to be comprehensive in that it covers every single album, because with Sparks, the flops are as interesting and as important as the hits, because the albums that miss, either they become kind of big cult albums in their own right, or they necessitate a change. And I think because that's the band that Sparks are, it's just interesting that there's this kind of it's not a standard like rise and fall and rise. Like their career is going like this the whole time. And Sparks themselves, I think, Ron and Russell, you know, I think they had turned down previous documentaries because people had said, oh, we just want to focus on the 70s. And I think the thing is, Ron and Russell quite rightly see themselves as a going concern. You know, it was interesting, during the filming, we went into Tower Records in Japan, and we were looking for Sparks albums in the Tower Records, and Sparks were in the 70s section, the 80s section, the 90s section, and the contemporary section. And I sort of said, well, that says it all, doesn't it? Like, it's like, so I think the thing is that what appealed to Ron and Russell was that I was going to tell the whole story. And that was interesting to me, because most documentaries about a band cover like a golden period. Like a Rolling Stones documentary will cover the 60s and the early 70s and then stop, because like the later stuff, no disrespect, is less interesting. You know, a Beatles documentary, they only lasted for like 8 years total in terms of their recorded output. So it's quite unusual with the Sparks documentary to cover like 50 years, because in covering 50 years of records, you also end up covering 50 years of culture, of how TV changes, how music videos change, like how production changes. So that in itself was interesting to me.
Absolutely. And talking about covering 50 years of someone's lives and career, if I understood correctly, you as well conducted 80 interviews in addition to that. And
yeah, that's true.
I was wondering.
I think I could have kept going as well. I think there was a point where we had to stop. I was quite happy to keep interviewing people about Sparks forever, but then at some point the producer said, "Okay, that's it. This is the last day."
How did that go though? 80 interviews, 50 years of archives. You add as well animation. So the question is also why and how come animation?
Well, the animation thing was two things. Was that number one, obviously there's an amazing amount of archive in terms of photos and footage, but there are also great stories where there's no archive at all. So because also they have used animation in their videos, and they are like, just through the fan art, there's so many great drawings of Ron and Russell. It just seemed to me like a no-brainer to do animation. And then because their style keeps changing, to do it in lots of different styles of animation. So the main animator was a stop motion animator called Joseph Wallace. And then we also brought on other animators like Greg McLeod, did all the 2D animation. And then there were little sequences where, you know, say when we're talking about their manga film falling apart, and when Tim Burton leaves the project and the film kind of like collapses, there's no footage of that. So we thought, well, why don't we do that in the style of like a manga strip? You know, so it's sort of ideas of ways of dramatizing events where there is no footage.
Since we have quite a few people here, I thought that it's a good opportunity to maybe open up a little bit.
Hello. First of all, thank you for all of your films, not just this one. Sorry if I repeat any questions, because we just walked off the screening a few minutes ago. Today we saw your movie, and last night we saw Annette. We saw it, so it was a Sparks double feature in a way. It was surreal. My questions are: was it surreal for you communicating with the Sparks brothers? Were you fanboying all the time? And did you have an opportunity to speak about their response to the movies? Did they like Annette? Were they satisfied? And what was their reaction to your movie? Thank you so much.
I first met them in 2015, and that came about because I was writing with a friend of mine, and he didn't really know Sparks, and we were talking about Sparks all day. And then I suddenly thought, I wonder if Sparks are on Twitter. And they were following me, which was like mind-blowing. And I felt bad that I wasn't following them. I didn't even know they had a Twitter account. So I immediately messaged and said, is this actually the band? I'm such a big fan. And it said, yeah, this is Russell. So Russell replied by DM. And so within 48 hours, I was in Los Angeles at the time, and I met them for breakfast. And so at that point, I was kind of like, definitely fanboying out, having breakfast with Ron and Russell. However, as you see in the documentary, they're incredibly charming and modest and funny. And people say you shouldn't meet your heroes. And then there are exceptions to that. And Ron and Russell were the exception to that. So I always get kind of, I mean, I know them very well now. And what I love about them is I'm always like, just kind of can't quite get over the fact that I'm in the room with Sparks, but also they're so normal and nice and funny that like we get on really well. When I was making the documentary, there were people I interviewed that I was quite starstruck by because I didn't know them as well. And suddenly I'm in the room with them. So weirdly, like interviewing other rock stars like Duran or like Vince Clarke and Andy Bell, or Chris Difford from Squeeze, you know, that was kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this, you know, so that was definitely quite disconcerting. They really loved the movie. I showed it to them a number of times whilst I was still editing. So they saw like a more unfinished cut, but they were so happy with it. And what was really important to me about that is that they're so protective of their image. They let me have final cut, and there wasn't anything. There was one thing that they were unsure whether it was worth having in there, but I was really strongly felt that it was, which was the bit where we were talking about them running out of money in the 80s. And they said, oh, do you think people really want to hear about that? And I said, yeah. I said, absolutely. I think that's the most inspiring bit for other musicians, is like you've reached like rock bottom in terms of that there's nothing happening and you can pull out of that is really important. And then in terms of Annette, I think they're really proud of it. I mean, they I don't know if you saw the Caesars, they won a ton of awards for it, and Leos Carax won Best Director at Cannes. So I know they're really proud of Annette. And also I know that they're writing something else that's like in that vein, not a sequel, but another, I guess like another sort of movie, musical, opera type thing.
Are there any questions?
Hello. You of course spent quite some time working with Sparks on this documentary, but since you are such a big fan, I imagine that you would probably want to work with them again at some point. And my question would be, if you could do something Sparks related in the future, what would that be?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to. I'd love to do something else with them. You know, like I know that they have other kind of like sort of filmic aspirations after Annette, so maybe there'll be something like that. But I nothing to confirm or deny.
When it comes to that, I was wondering as well whether the Sparks brothers, whether they're involved in the creative process of this film.
In terms of the documentary.
Exactly.
I mean, they, in a very nice way, they left me to it because they didn't want to editorialize. The important thing is that they trusted me, and I don't think they would have done a documentary at all unless they knew and trusted the director. So the fact that I'd known them for 2.5 years, maybe like by the time we actually started shooting, it's probably about 3 years. That was really important. If it was somebody that they didn't know, I don't think they would have done it. And if they had, I'm not sure they would have opened up in the same way. So there's sort of little things that come out in the documentary where they reveal maybe more than they would like to. But I think it was because it was like us talking as friends. And those are some of my favorite bits in the documentary, is when, because they like to stay pretty mysterious about their private lives, and I respect that. And I don't want to kind of make a film about their private lives, because I think a lot of documentaries, you know, focus only on that and don't really focus on the work. And for Ron Russell, the work is important. But there are moments in the documentary where they, you know, bits about their private lives do come through. And to their credit, they never asked me to cut them out. And they thought it was funny and they liked it. So I think the important thing was that they trusted me and they let me have final cut.
I'm reaching out to the audience once again, if there are any questions. If not, then I think I still have a few minutes for another question. I was wondering as well, if I'm not mistaken, this is your first documentary. So I was wondering as well, how did that go for you, and whether you've ever considered as well maybe making a fiction when it comes to the Sparks?
What, a fictional biopic?
For instance.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I think maybe I've already covered the Sparks story, but it was great doing a documentary. I mean, it wasn't something that I had necessarily planned to do, but I kept thinking about how, you know, like I said, how great a Sparks documentary would be. So I made it sort of in tandem with my last movie, Last Night in Soho. You know, I was writing Last Night in Soho, then I sort of started shooting the Sparks documentary and was writing all the way through it. And then, you know, and then I shot Last Night in Soho, and then I shot a few more bits of Sparks and edited it. So the editing of both films was going on at the same time, which was pretty crazy. I mean, as a process, what was different about it is, obviously with the documentary, you're sort of constantly amassing parts of the story. And within our kind of production, it's like, oh, you know, the first thing we did was we shot them. I shot a London concert, you know, playing in London. And that was the thing where we kind of like finally started making the film after talking about it. It's like, we have to shoot their London concert. So we did that. And then it was like, they're going to Japan. We should go to Japan with them. You know, we went to Mexico with them. They'd never played Mexico as Sparks. And then around that, we started doing the interviews in different countries. So we shot in like London and Los Angeles and New York. And then only one interview was done by remote. So and I guess that was was about 9 months of like production. And then, I mean, not full time, but 9 months on and off. And then after Last Night in Soho, I did a few more bits. I went to the set of Annette, because Annette shot afterwards. And then also I did 1 or 2 more interviews, and that was it basically. So it was just interesting. And throughout the entire period, like archive is coming in. There was a lot of stuff that was pre-existing, but we kept going on the search for things that were considered missing. And we put the word out to Sparks fans. Do you have anything, you know, do you have any photos or any footage or any stories? So things that are in the movie are sort of things that came through that, like bits of footage that hadn't been seen forever, fan photos. Some of the fans that feature in the movie, we approached because they emailed us with stories. Like the great moment with the Julia Marcus, who is the stage invader, age like 13. She wrote that story in an email, and it was such a great email. And we're thinking, well, let's get her on camera to say it. So all of the fans that are in the movie are people that kind of wrote to us with like stories that they wanted to tell.
Well, how many, I have 2 questions right there. How many of those emails and letters did you receive, and how long was the first cut of the film? I started wondering right now.
Kate Griffiths, who was our archive producer, and she's worked on a lot of music documentaries. She said that she had a bigger response to a request for Sparks material than anything else she's ever worked on. There are a lot of people out there that sort of said, yes, I want to contribute. The first assemble edit of the movie was like 9 hours long. And then I got it down to like 4 hours. And then I got it down to the current length. And it's funny, people like Sparks fans say, will we ever see the 4-hour version? And it's like, no, because like you have to pay for all of those clips. And like, you know, so even just the clips that are in the movie and the amount of clearance for all of those clips, every clip and every photo and every song has to be cleared. So, you know, if you get the Blu-ray, there's a lot of extra material on there. There's lots of things that we shot that there wasn't time for. So I put a lot of that stuff on there because there's some really fun other stuff. But it was basically, I wanted people to watch it in one sitting. I didn't want it to be like a series or 2 movies or anything.
Are there any maybe more questions, or is there anyone who would like to share, since we'll be running out of time really soon? I guess before we say goodbye, I just wanted to thank you once again. And as for the last question, I was really wondering if you could share with us maybe a few favorite songs of Sparks with us. Which ones will be the most favorite to you?
It's tricky because it's difficult to say pick one Sparks album because they have so many great albums, but also there's so many different sounds. So when people say, if I had to listen to one Sparks album, what would it be? I'd be like, no one album tells the whole story. If I had to pick one song, I mean, number one song in heaven, rather, is like, means a lot to me because it was one of the first Sparks songs I heard. And, you know, if you've heard that song, it's like 2 songs for the price of one. It has the whole slow bit, and then it goes into kind of the fast dance bit. And on the 7-inch, it was like the slow bit was on one side and the fast bit was on another side. But so that's like, I think is my favorite Spark song.
I believe that on that note, we'll have to say goodbye, and we'll go back home right now to listen to those songs that that you have just mentioned right now. And I think thanks to the film in general, we'll be all delving into the music of Sparks in general, as I've mentioned before the Q&A. So once again, Mr. Wright, thank you very much for being present, for being with us, for having this talk with us. And thank you for the film. And we hope to see you at some point here in Lithuania.
I'd love to come over. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.